I just recently finished up the Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney trilogy, and since there are so many different cases in the first 3 games, I thought it would be fun to present what I thought were the worst and best cases in the series so far. Since the Ace Attorney games always seem to start with the bad news first before you dig yourself out with a nice turnabout, I'll start this list the same way by looking at the cases I enjoyed the least. I will be using 1 through 5 for both halves, but for the worst cases, 5 will actually be the most enjoyable, while 1 will be what I thought was the worst of the cases in Phoenix Wright. While I did try to avoid spoilers in my recent review of the trilogy, spoilers will abound here, so be forewarned if you haven't played the series before. Also, these are just my opinions. I have no doubt that there are different opinions out there on these cases and the way to order them, so feel free to share your own lists in the comments. So let's start with the cases that I thought were the worst. Number 5 on the worst of list is Turnabout Big Top. This could be a controversial choice here. Shu Takumi, the creator of the Ace Attorney series, calls this one of his favorites. So clearly there are opinions on this case that are so very drastically different than my own. This case just had a number of things that I didn't enjoy going on. There wasn't anything major like some of the others that we'll see on this side of the list, but a combination of factors that just made this case near the bottom for me. A little background on the case is that the case focuses on a murder at a circus, hence the Big Top part of the title. The ringleader of the circus is found murdered, and Max Galactica, the circus's star magician, is the main suspect. What is it about this case that earns it such a low spot in my books? As I already said, it isn't any one major issue, but a combination of things just kind of working against the case in general. The biggest of the issues is that I didn't really care for any of the characters that were involved with this case. Max is okay, but definitely not my favorite client, as he's a bit too over the top in kind of like a self-aggrandizing way. And his secret history as a country bumpkin is kind of funny, but doesn't really add a lot to the character. The supporting cast of the case is not as enjoyable. There is the cute, naive daughter of the ringleader, Regina, who all the guys are seeking the affection of, even though she's only 16 or 17 in the case. Yeah, it's a little awkward. So she's a bit too oblivious just in general, and then the combination of her age and the romantic attention towards her is a bit awkward feeling at best. The circus's ventriloquist, Ben Woodman, and the clown Mo are also just kind of annoying, cliche-feeling characters. Ben is the type of ventriloquist who is quiet and mild-mannered, but whose puppet is rude and bullies the puppeteer. Mo is a clown that makes up for his lack of being funny with volume and obnoxiousness. Honestly, this was probably my least favorite character in the whole collection. So yeah, the supporting cast here is just not great. Besides the supporting cast being less than stellar, I also have an issue with the reveal of the actual murderer. Our actual murderer feels like he isn't revealed until a lot later than most of the cases in the game, making it feel like the game was intentionally blocking that character from view in order to mislead you. I mean, he's also part of the circus, but we don't even know much about him until the second half of the case. Like, I do understand that sometimes the actual murderer is a little bit hidden in the case, but there's usually a reason for it. They've got somebody working for them, or they're just not as clear, whereas the murderer here was part of the circus, should have been somebody you saw early on in the case, but wasn't. I also felt that the motivation for the murder and the backstory weren't the best here either. A sneezing lion is definitely interesting, but I also felt that Regina was actually knowledgeable about animal training and how to deal with her animals much more than anything in normal life, and that she probably would have caught this before it happened. It all just felt a bit too contrived, and this was also a standalone case with little effect to the wider narrative, so it just didn't have enough of an impact to make up for the flaws. There is a bit of a tragic side to this story, and it does have an interesting way of having the crime be committed, but between the obnoxious characters, a culprit that is oddly hidden, and a bit of a strange setup, it fails to be one of my favorites and earns the first spot on my worst case list. Number 4 on the worst case list is the first Turnabout. Unlike the first choice, this case has a very simple reason for being this low. This was the tutorial level for the first game. It's probably the best tutorial case for me, but it's also not a very complicated case. There is only a trial phase to the case without any investigation, which is pretty much normal for all of the tutorial cases, at least in the original trilogy. You are introduced to Mia Fey here and Phoenix's friend Larry Butts, who I'll admit I'm not a huge fan of, but there just really isn't a lot of an impact to this case case on the larger narrative other than a certain peculiar murder weapon. The case finds Larry accused of murdering his girlfriend or ex-girlfriend. It's not exactly clear where he's standing at the point in time that things are going on here. It's good for getting your feet wet in the world of Phoenix Wright, but it's not one that is really going to stick with you as you move forward. As I said, that's a pretty simple reason why I'm not a huge fan of that one, so we'll move on to my third worst, which is Turnabout Memories. This is another tutorial level, but also might be a bit of a controversial choice for being so low. My problem with this case, besides simply being basically a tutorial case, is that it seems to retcon the history of Phoenix and Mia. The case takes place in the past while Phoenix is in college. He is accused of murdering Doug Swallow, a fellow student at Ivy University. So instead of playing as Phoenix here, you're playing as Mia Fey in her second case as a defense attorney. You got the sense that the second case in the first game, Turnabout Sisters, is the first time that Phoenix had been tried for murder. But this would not have been the case if the events of this case are actually true in Turnabout Memories. He also had met Grossberg earlier than the second case from the first game as well. So it just messes up the previous story a bit. Not a lot. It doesn't drastically shift things. It doesn't really make a difference whether this was his actual first murder case or not, and whether he met Grossberg or not. Like, they don't do a lot, but it just kind of made me feel like they just were shoving something in. And at the time that I was playing it, I didn't realize really why they were setting this up, and so it just felt really cheap. Now, admittedly, this case does introduce us to the best and what winds up being the most recurrent villain of the series so far, but I still felt like it didn't fit the established narrative, and I didn't really enjoy that too much. Like, as I said, like right after the case, I thought it was the absolute worst of the cases so far. But the introduction of Dahlia Hawthorne and how she played a part in later cases did help raise this up a couple spots. That and one of the later cases in the third games really just blows into absurd territory and takes that bottom spot no problem. So let's move to the second worst case of the Ace Attorney trilogy, and that is the Lost Turnabout. Now, you're probably pretty used to getting a tutorial level in the worst cases, and here is no different. This is the tutorial level for the second game in the trilogy. I thought it was by far the weakest of the tutorial levels, and it decided to add a little side of amnesia, which I wasn't a fan of in this situation. I do think that amnesia can sometimes be an okay narrative tool, but here it didn't really work for me. I tend to like it more as a introduction to character we don't really know and getting to learn them, rather than coming to another game in a series and then you have that character get amnesia to kind of forget what's going on just so you can get reminded again. Like, those don't work out so well for me and my tastes, and that's what happens here. So it just didn't really work. The story behind the case is that Maggie Bird, a policewoman, is accused of killing fellow policeman Dustin Prince by pushing him off a ledge. He landed in such a way that snapped his neck. The case itself has a really weak feeling. It felt like it was pretty easy to figure out that Maggie wasn't the killer. She may be this goddess of misfortune and have absolutely no luck, but that doesn't make somebody a killer. It just felt very much like an obvious, easy case to introduce the second game, and didn't really stick with me much beyond not being super enjoyable to play through. And the absolute worst case of the Ace Attorney trilogy is Recipe for Turnabout. Now, Maggie Bird makes another reappearance on the worst case list, but I'll be honest here, I didn't really mind her as a character. Sure, she wasn't my favorite by any means, but she's not the reason for her cases being the two worst in my opinion. Instead, it is more about what is going on around the cases that caused these to be so low on the list. Recipe for Turnabout has Maggie being accused of poisoning a man at the cafe that she is currently working at. While this may not seem bad as a setup, the story starts out with her having been found guilty, even though supposedly being defended by Phoenix Wright. Now, it wasn't actually Phoenix, it was someone impersonating him, and this is where the case earns the bottom spot, like right from the beginning. I get that the legal system in Phoenix Wright has its issues and that it's not exactly like our own legal system, but not having the ability to check if lawyers are actually who they are is a huge issue. It isn't even like the impersonator is convincing at all. They look quite different than Phoenix. They have a much different temperament and an attorney's badge made out of paper. Yes, you heard me right, made out of paper. This is just a very awkwardly done scenario, and it just, as I said, it turned me off right from the start. Add in a supporting cast of characters that were not my favorite and a case that was just all sorts of convoluted. It was easily my least favorite case in the Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney trilogy. That wraps up my list of least favorite cases in the Ace Attorney trilogy. but what were some of my favorites? So that's what we're going to take a look at now. Remember at this halfway point that spoilers are going to be aplenty here. Don't move on if you want to experience some of these stories for yourself. Also, remember these are just my opinions. If you have different lists up here, that's fine. Feel free to share. I'm glad to hear what your top cases are. These are just the ones that I really enjoy. So number 5 on the best case list is Farewell My Turnabout. This is the final case of the second game, Justice for All. The case itself isn't directly connected to the main cast other than them being at the location it happens at the time of the murder. Action star Juan Corrida is murdered and the suspect in the case is rival action star Matt Ungard. However, your group of friends gets directly involved when a mysterious man kidnaps Maya to blackmail Phoenix into getting a not guilty verdict for Matt. Now you might be like, wait, why would he need blackmail to get him a non-guilty verdict? All of our other clients haven't been guilty so far, and we've never failed to deliver so far. And that is what's really setting this case apart from a lot of the other cases that we take. For once, our client isn't exactly innocent. He's actually a big piece of trash who hired an assassin to kill the victim. The assassin, Shelly the Killer, being the one to kidnap Maya in order to get Phoenix to clear his client's name. Now, the downside of this case is that it is a bit convoluted, which you'll notice that I use that word a lot. Like most of the cases in Phoenix Wright get a little convoluted. It's just the way it kind of works out. But this in particular feels like it's just set up to force Phoenix into defending someone who isn't actually innocent. Like the developers were just kind of like, you know what, we really want to find a way to have Phoenix defend a guilty person. How are we going to do this without Phoenix caring more about the truth than his defendant? That's what this feels like. Even so, this setup does really create an interesting dilemma. What is Phoenix going to do here? Is he going to put Maya above finding the truth of the case, or focus on the truth, maybe at the expense of someone he cares about? Or on a more positive note, is he going to focus on the truth and hope that his friends will be able to pull through and save Maya? It's an interesting case that challenges a lot of what we've come to see in Phoenix Wright cases before that. We have a case where Phoenix is unable to fully trust the person he is defending, which is the advice he's taken to heart from his mentor Mia Fey. He's also trying to protect someone who is very important to him at the same time. I also love this case because you get to see the cast really coming together to try to save Maya while at the same time having justice be served. So seeing Miles, Gumshoe, and even Franziska von Karma come together in order to do that was quite the experience, and I just really enjoyed how that all kind of played out. The fourth favorite is Bridge to the Turnabout. This is the final case in the third game, Trials and Tribulations, and the final case in the Ace Attorney trilogy. This case is the culmination of two different plot threads: the attempt to make Pearl Fey become the master of the Fey clan, and the final action of Dahlia Hawthorne, who was a recurring villain through this third game. Now this case is just full of people who aren't who they seem to be. Elise Stonim and Iris are both mysterious figures. Iris because she looks so much like Dahlia Hawthorne, and Elise because there seems to be much more to her than a children's book author. The supernatural elements of Phoenix Wright also play a huge role in this case, which leaves you wondering which spirit medium is channeling someone throughout the case. It's a good dose of mystery and keeps you wondering about who actually committed the crime and whether everyone is safe or not throughout the case. There are two really satisfying things that come from the conclusion of this case. The first is that, like Farewell My Turnabout, you get the sense of the main cast working together to figure things out, at least as much as they can, given their various roles. Edgeworth actually takes over as the defense attorney for the first day of the trial because Phoenix gets injured trying to cross a burning bridge to get to Maya and make sure she's safe. Edgeworth then calls Franziska von Karma to act as the prosecutor for the first day as well, so they can have the trial go forward and that he'd be able to defend Iris and hopefully leave the trial unsolved and be able to go into a second day. Second thing I really like is that it resolves so many loose ends that the game has been mentioning since the first game in the series. We find out where Misty Fey is, and that's Mia and Maya's mother. We find out more about who Godot is and what his motivations are. We figure out how Dahlia is able to make Phoenix feel like she actually cared for him when she's really a cold, calculating person. And we also saw Morgan attempt once again to get rid of Maya to take control over the Fey clan in what has to be probably one of the last ditch attempts that she has. It's a mostly satisfying end to the game and the trilogy and feels like it holds all of that weight well. Now while I did enjoy this case and I felt felt that it was a fitting conclusion, it still does fall short in some ways for me. A significant portion of this is that a lot of the heavy lifting in the backstory of this case comes from Dolly and Iris actually being the daughters of Morgan Fay as well. It all seems a little too convenient, and while it does wind up working fairly well, I think, adds a level of complexity and disbelief that sets it under the remaining cases on this list. My third favorite is Reunion and Turnabout. This case is the second case in the second game of the trilogy, Justice for All, where Phoenix is reunited with Maya after she went to train her spiritual ability at the end of the first game. Instead of a happy reunion, it is marred by what else but a murder. Here we see Maya accused of murder for the second time in the series. It's a bit of a complicated setup for the case though. A surgeon wants to channel a former employee of his that died in an accident. This surgeon had a bit of a scandal around the time of this accident where 14 of his patients died due to mixed up medications. He wants to channel this former nurse of his to have her admit to the mistakes, as there are people who think that the mistakes were his and that he even killed the woman to keep her silent. Now, during this channeling, things go south and the doctor is murdered. You are led to believe that the woman who Maya channeled killed the doctor. As with all of the cases in Phoenix Wright, there is more to this case than appears on the surface, and so seeking out the truth we go. Now, before I get to what I enjoyed about the case, let me start with the elephant in the room with this case for me. If Maya killed someone while channeling another person's spirit, is it really her who killed someone? I feel like that's a huge legal question that isn't really dealt with here. This winds up not being the case at all, and so doesn't really matter in the bigger scheme of things, but it still starts that way, and I felt like that detail was just kind of largely ignored and passed over. Even with the elephant in the room here, there is a lot of good stuff in this case. Probably the most interesting story-wise is getting to take a better look at the family politics of the Faye clan. It helps to contextualize the situation a little better, rather than just making Maya this random girl with spiritual power. Part of this contextualization is the inclusion of Pearl Faye, who also has rather strong spiritual powers. She's a very cute and clueless addition to the cast. She tends to think that Maya and Phoenix are a couple and is very much rooting for them to be happy, even to the point of smacking Phoenix around if she thinks he's getting a bit too cozy with other women, which in her book is basically talking to another woman. She's a big fan of Maya, even though her mother Morgan wants Pearl to be the next master of the Faye clan instead of Maya, and would be kind of horrified at what her mother's trying to do to Maya in order to have that happen. Another fun addition in this case is the introduction of the Psylocks. Pearl puts some spiritual power into Maya's Magatama that allows Phoenix to see when people are lying to him and hiding secrets. I don't think it added a lot to the game. It's not bad either, and it was a good way of getting information and using evidence outside of the trial sections of the game. I also just like the path that this case takes. While I do get a bit tired of Maya being the constant damsel in distress, either being kidnapped or the murder suspect, like, the case did wind up taking some surprising turns for me and was satisfying. I mean, I was kind of suspicious of the people involved with the actual crime in this one. I just didn't have all of the motives figured out. I thought that the motive was going to be revenge for at least one of the people who were involved with the murder, but it wound up being something quite a bit more complicated, which I thought was enjoyable to see. The second favorite case in the Ace Attorney trilogy is Turnabout Sisters. Now, this case is just the second case in the original Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney game. Now, while the case I just talked about had Maya as the defendant, this is the case that introduced Maya and had her be accused of murdering her very own sister, Mia Fay. Now, this case just took me by surprise. As you're introduced to Mia in the first case, you were like looking forward to working with her on future cases, but then she's suddenly murdered and any hopes of that are dashed. Well, you at least think it's dashed, but that's not really fully the case since Mia winds up being able to be channeled by her sister or Pearl many times throughout the trilogy. However, it still created just a significant emotional impact right from the start that at least I was not expecting to have happen. This case also plants the seeds of plot points that will continue for quite some time in the Phoenix Wright series. These plot points are all centered around the DL6 incident, which affected the lives of many people in the series. While many of these are resolved by the end of the first game, there are still some that linger throughout the series, the biggest being the impact of that case on the reputation of the Faye clan and the location of Misty Fay, master of the Faye clan and mother of Mia and Maya. They really had a thing for M names apparently in that family. So This is just an amazing introduction to the Phoenix Wright world. While the first case may have eased us into the gameplay, this is an introduction to the world at large. While the world isn't a pretty one with corruption and incompetence abounding, it is one that is interesting and complex. This is the first case with overarching story connections and is your first taste of what will be true of the best cases in the original trilogy. This is also the case that introduces us to many of the enduring characters of the Phoenix Wright series. Maya Fey, Dick Gumshoe, and Miles Edgeworth are all first seen here, and while that doesn't elevate the case too much for me, it's still a point worth acknowledging as well. I don't know, this case just hit me in a totally unexpected way and really helped me dive into the world in a meaningful, impactful way. This is why it's one of my favorites. It really feels that it throws you in the deep end right from the start, at least in an emotional and story-centered way. Certainly not what I was expecting for only the second case in the game, but I'm happy that it was. And my favorite case from the Ace Attorney trilogy is Turnabout Goodbyes. While Turnabout Sisters may have introduced us to the world of Phoenix Wright and the big events like the DL6 incident, my favorite case is the one that resolves that infamous incident. Turnabout Goodbyes is a case where we find Miles Edgeworth as the defendant. He's accused of murdering defense attorney Robert Hammond, the defense attorney that was involved with the murder case of Miles' father, Gregory Edgeworth. Now, this was originally the last case in the first game, but became the penultimate case as Rise from the Ashes was added to later versions of that first game. Now, in some ways, you could argue that this is really wrapping up two cases in one. One part about who murdered Robert Hammond, and then the second part about figuring out who murdered Gregory Edgeworth before the statute of limitations runs out on that case. There's just so much going on in this case that connects past and present, and it's hard not to find it compelling. It is able to explain the change in Miles Edgeworth's character from when Phoenix knew him when they were kids, and becomes a turning point that causes Miles to reevaluate his views on what being a prosecutor means. This provides the series with a rare situation of character development, and it really shines due to this impact. Miles has been your kind of antagonist the last couple of cases, and seeing that switch from having to fight with him to then having to defend him, it just works real nice and kind of creates an interesting dynamic that becomes more of what Miles's and Phoenix's dynamic is throughout the rest of the series. It's just kind of an interesting change in dynamics for their relationship. While previous cases have shown us that there is a good deal of corruption in the world, with Red White from the Turnabout Sisters case, and even Miles's tactics as a prosecutor, this case really shines a light on how deep that corruption goes. It winds up being revealed that the prosecutor in this case, Manfred von Karma, is the mastermind of the current killing and the murderer of Gregory Edgeworth. It's one of those twists that you kind of wonder about, but don't actually expect that to be the case, but the game totally goes there. Now, all the combination of these aspects are why it is my favorite case. Like, I really liked Edgeworth as a character, even though he rubbed you the wrong way at first. Seeing him start the path of actually seeking justice with this case was really cool, and it definitely pays off as you see it kind of playing out furthermore as you go into later cases. I also really like how Wright is able to turn enemies into friends, rivals, or reluctant allies, and you see that starting to happen here as Miles kind of slowly warms up to Phoenix over the course of the case, kind of. Sure, the case does fall into the trap of all of the Phoenix Wright cases, requiring a good amount of unlikely things to happen to get things all to work out, and this one also has the weird Gordy aspect of the case that doesn't really add much, in my opinion. Even so, this winds up being my favorite case from the Ace Attorney trilogy. If I'm being completely honest though, I would say that all of the top 4 cases here are very close in terms of how much I like them, so while this is my order, don't really think that there's a lot of distance between these top 4. The 5th one does have a little bit more space with it, as I do think there are things that made it a little bit less enjoyable for me, but these top 4 are all really good and really enjoyable cases. Now that concludes my look at the 5 worst and 5 best cases of the Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney trilogy. As I said at the start of the video, this is simply my opinion and isn't by any means the conclusive set of best and worst cases. Given this, I would love to hear what cases you liked or didn't like from the original 3 games in the Ace Attorney series, especially if they're different than the ones that I've put out there. It's always super interesting to hear why certain cases really resonate with people or what fails to click in certain stories for certain people. Now, if I do play any other Ace Attorney games, which I am planning on, at least at some point, playing the Apollo Justice trilogy when it releases in 2024, you can expect to see an expanded video that includes those games in the list. I'll probably create separate videos for the best cases and the worst cases when we get to that point, since there will be more cases. I figured going into this list with only 14 cases, making a top 10 doesn't really work the best, because some of those are going to be cases that you don't really like all that much, and trying to do a top 10 and a bottom 10 meant there would be a lot of overlap. So that's why we've got a split here of 5 and 5, and going forward, that'll probably change if I do make another video like this. All that to say, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.